Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. I want to welcome you all to this open seminar of our interactive histories, co-produced communities. I want to just say a word before handing it over to Maureen Atali to introduce our speaker about the times we find ourselves in. As you know, the goal of our project is to provide the foundations for a new history of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as co-produced communities. And of course, the goal of that history is to make clear that the many different ideas and ideals that each of these communities has formed and continues to form by interacting with or imagining each other. And I just want to point out the obvious, that we live in a moment in which that process is as sharp and evident and painful and also hard to see as it has ever been. And I find it personally very both difficult, but also illuminating to notice how how little, how helpless one feels despite being devoted to this process in such a moment. I also want to just take a moment to remember a number of our colleagues who cannot be here today. Israel Yuval, for example, told me he very much wanted to see Johannes and hear Johannes, but that his heart is too distracted to be here in such a moment, and that he very much hopes we're recording the session, which we are. And like Israel, there are many others. So I just bring them to our thoughts. And with that, I will pass the microphone to Maureen, who will moderate our session.
Hi, so it's my great pleasure to introduce today Professor Dr. Johannes Heil from the Center for Jewish Study in Heidelberg, where he is Professor of History, Religion, and Culture of European Judaism. He has written and edited many books about Jewish history, focusing on the transition from antiquity to the Middle Ages, Jews in Europe in the Middle Ages and early modern times, as well as historiography of Jewish history and Judeo-Christian relationships. Of particular interest for our project, I think, is his monography on Jews in the Pauline commentaries of the 9th century, which was published in 1998. And I should also mention his co-edited book on Abraham's legacy, competition, conflict, and coexistence of religions in the European Middle Ages, which was published in German in 2015. His last publication is a collective work co-edited with Sumi Shimyahara, From Theodulf to Rashi and Beyond, Text, Techniques, and Transfer in Western European Exegesis, which came out last year. And he is also the initiator and director of the digital New Gallia Germania Judaica. So today, Professor Heil is going to give us some insights about his current book project on the pre-rabbinic Jewish culture of the Western Mediterranean between 400 and 800 CE, focusing on the anonymous text Questiones in Libros Regnum and Parabipomenon. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Maureen, not only for this kind introduction, but also for the good preparation of this session. And I hope technically everything will work well. I hope you can hear me in quite a good manner. Please give me a sign if I'm too far away from the micro or whatever. And I also want to thank Katharina Hayden in Bern and David Nierenberg in Princeton. Thank you so much for inviting me, dear friends, to join your work and to be part of it. And I also want to welcome the students from Heidelberg, because normally we would have a class now. It's the first meeting of the term, and we changed it. Some of them are still writing exams in languages, so they may join us sometime later. And I especially want to welcome not only all the other guests who are interested in this topic, in this project, which actually is the revision of a footnote of my 1905 book on Jews in Carolingian exegesis, a question I had left open at the time, and I returned to the question a couple of years ago, and now it's becoming bigger book. But welcome to all the guests, and especially to Gideon Bohak from Tel Aviv and his colleagues, his collaborators and others from Israel in those days. We heard about Israel, whom I met in Spiez, thanks to Katharina a couple of months ago. And I fully understand that not everyone can understand such an event here via Zoom as kind of distraction during those days. Everyone needs to react in his personal way. And all our thoughts are with colleagues, with friends, with family members in the area in those days. So how Jews turned into Jeromes. I open my screen and I hope you will soon be able to see it in full screen. So now you should see the screen in full. And I start with telling that the posthumous careers of the most important known Jewish authors of the first century, Philo and Josephus, are well known. The one protected quasi as church father honoris causa, the other as a witness to the time environment of Jesus, and thus as a crown witness for the history of salvation as the church understood it. The afterlives of the Jewish authors actually occurred as entirely Christian careers. Explicit Jewish traces of Philo and other texts of Greek Judaism are absent after the 2nd century. Josephus is preserved in the Sefer Yosipon, but this paraphrase is probably a product only of the 10th century in Byzance. It is suspected, with good reason, that some of Philo's thoughts is buried in Agadic texts. If so, the rabbis have been silent about the origin of their knowledge and the author. The reasons for this are of no importance at this point, however. An occupation with Philo's person and work on the Jewish side can be grasped only in the 16th century, and then the Alexandrian scholar, philosopher came along like the well-known uncle from America, a close relative but somehow weird. The Mantuan Azaria de Rossi struggled to free Philo from the constraints of his Christian servitude and to restore him as a Jewish author. On the other hand, Philo's Greek world of thought and his concept of Judaism remained incomprehensible to the Italian Jewish humanist. It hardly fitted in with the rabbinically formed ways of thinking and Azaria's project of translating Jewish traditions into the intellectual world of Italian humanism. Philo vir desertissimus Judeorum. Why Philo fitted so easily into the Christian formation of ideas should already have been dealt with abundantly. I will leave that to the theologians otherwise. As a historian, I'm more interested in the significance of the afterlife of Jewish authors and their works into Christian career paths. I grasp this with the term the Philo filter. Works that were absorbed by the Christian tradition, and in this process, possibly some things were eliminated that appeared to be irrelevant, superfluous, or perhaps even offensive from a Christian perspective of view. What I aim for is to get beyond the rather simple statement that the Jews, Philo and Josephus, owe their transmission of their works to Christian recipients. And likewise, I do not want to pursue the question whether the Christian reception was an outrageous appropriation or, on the contrary, a lack for the survival of the works of the Jewish authors. This seems to me not only an idle question, but basically a wrong one. For epistemically, by transferring the later evidence to religious cultural contrast between hegemonic Christianities and marginalized Jewish communities to the conditions of the second until fourth century, it steers into a blind spot from which the view on actually fruitful questions remains obscured. It seems better to reverse the evidence and not to regard Philo and Josephus as adopted sons of the Christian literary production against their will, But to understand the Christian works as part of a much more general, broader late antique literary production, to which classical as well as Jewish authors are to be counted. To clarify what I mean, I refer to Augustine. Of course, one can call him a Christian author. That is how he became effective. Equally, however, one can consider him a late classical author who, from a certain point on, wrote works that met Christian expectations, but were based entirely on his classical education. The same is true for Cassiodorus, Venantius Fortunatus, and others. And even more so can be said about Jerome. Certainly, it is identity justified to call him a Christian author, who occasionally consulted Jewish interpreters and texts. However, I would rather understand him as an author who moved in a linguistically as well as medially open space and used resources that were universally accessible to write, in his case, texts for a primarily Christian audience. And some of Jerome's works, such as the Questiones Hebraicae on the books of Genesis, bear so little explicitly Christian content that one can at points imagine them in the hands of Jewish readers. One may regard these differentiations I make as nuances. However, for the questions of conditions of transmission of Jewish texts in Christian tradition, they seem essential. For I argue that the philo-filter is not to be understood as a liminal border crossing, but as a visible outflow from the named linguistically as well as medially open space of late antique literary production. What I insist on can be shown less by the example of Philo and Josephus, but by other texts. That they were written by Jews, but were readable not only by Jews and have been preserved solely because scribes in monastic and episcopal scriptoria found such texts as we have since the late 8th century verse copying. From the 9th century up to the Clausa Ordinaria, they also found them worth citing, like Alcuin Rabanus, Haimo of Auxerre, Angelomus of Luxeuil, and others. I will come back to them. So I claim that Philo as well as Josephus were by no means only Jewish exotics in Christian scriptoria, but prominent exponents of a much broader phenomenon, of Jewish Latinity. Here, some preliminary remarks seem to be necessary. So my first part I call Japhne Pella and the parting of the ways. Hardly anyone today will seriously tell the story of the way of the Torah from Jerusalem to Japhne, or of the flight of an imagined early church from Jerusalem to Pella. Neither Rabbinic Judaism nor Christianity arose directly from the ruins of the temple. Japhne and Pella are narrative constructions that seek to name an origin from a distance of 2 or more centuries, while leveling the complexity of the historical course. The parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity, or the Romans, this has become much certain in the past decades, occurred gradually or did not come to a complete conclusion at any point in time. And Annette Yoshika Reed and Adam Becker have called this the ways that never parted. They cautiously speak only of, quotation, different biblically based religious groups, which were neither stable nor ideologically profiled, and which were subject to the efforts of normative actors, rabbis here, and councils and church fathers there. The borderlines, as Daniel Boyarin called it, were blurred and mobile at the same time. The different paths also did not move away from each other uniformly, but crossed each other at times, as Judith Lieu has pointed out. So much, in a few words, for what is actually a long story. But if the demarcation between the groups was not clearly as hermetic as later times want to suggest, then this should also apply to thoughts and texts. A church historian and a Judaic studies scholar who look today only on their own field define then epistemic zones which make sense technically, but prove historically as inconsistent and incomplete. However, the consequences of these insights have by no means been drawn everywhere. even in a companion to Jewish history in late antiquity, published in 2020 by Josh Ezra Burns, the Second Temple period is followed only by Babylonian rabbinical Judaism, and as almost 500 years of other Jewish history remain blanked out. Far more serious is the fact the further west the diaspora is located, the less important it appears to be. Basically, in most accounts, except Leonard Rutgers or Ross Shepard Kramer, for example, all Mediterranean landscapes west of the land of Israel remain more or less blank spaces. Indeed, these landscapes have long taken no part in the unfolding of rabbinic Judaism in the land of Israel and Babylonia. Joshua Burns found in 220 that, quote, surviving Jewish texts of that area are largely restricted to rabbinic writings. Indeed, knowledge of the Mishnah cannot be traced in the West before the late 8th century, and that only on funerary inscriptions in Venosa and the Basilicata. But this brings me to the second point, the relationship and the interference between language and religion. Here, a gross misunderstanding has to be named. If one understands, as Burns probably did, as Jewish texts exclusively those in Hebrew script, one will indeed find no Jewish texts in the West before the 8th and 9th century. At best, one wants to recognize Greek texts and language practices there even long after Philo. A recent dissertation even speaks of, quote, a self-evident monolingualism of Greek among the Jews of the West. The epigraphic findings, and here I have photos from the catacomb in the Vigna Rambanini in Rome, which I took in 2017. These epigraphic findings, however, speak a different language. In Rome, it is indeed mostly, so by no means exclusively, you see here the Aurelia Flavia buried in the Vigna Rambanini. It's by no means exclusively Greek and hardly any Hebrew. Elsewhere in Italy, and especially in North Africa, however, it is, apart from B and trilingual inscriptions, often in hybrid versions, it is predominantly Latin. This is true for the funerary inscriptions or for the 5th or 6th century foundation inscription in the floor of the synagogue of Naro of Hamalif, close to Tunis in Tunisia today, where we find the inscription for the Sanctam Synagogam Narotinam pro salutem suam ancillatua Juliana presbytera de sua proprium tesselavit. The interesting case is that Juliana is called P, what normally is read as Puella, but this doesn't make sense that a Puella would donate a floor for a synagogue. So I read at this point, presbytera, whatever this may mean. Such examples of Latinity reveal a very different Judaism, one that was culturally embedded in its Roman Latin environment, and yet held its own. It was especially not absorbed into the church. The dimensions of the synagogues of Ostia, Bova Marina, and Calabria, or the Tunisian ones in Hamamlif and Kilibia, reveal a decidedly self-confident Jewry. 4 archaeologically secured synagogues in the West, maybe 6 when we count Elche and Carthago, but I'm skeptical about this, and a dozen known by name in Rome are not much, one might object. But without clear ornamentation or inscriptions, it is anyway difficult to identify synagogues as such, and many buildings may have been missed because of the lack of the possibility of identification. Be that as it may, the Jews who prayed in the synagogue of Ostia were sincerely more than only biblical Jews, as has been argued, and they may have possessed and known more than just one scroll. This assumption is supported by the inscriptional evidence, for example, mentioning didascalies or teachers, or Christian testimonies speaking about the doctores legis, the teachers of the law. Both times one may ask, what was the material of this instruction? Only Torah or also other texts? The assumption that there was more than just one book is supported by a number of texts, obviously of Jewish origin, which have been preserved, Philofilter is that work, only in a Christian tradition. So I come to the third point, to the medieval evidence. For the dispatch of his commentaries on the Book of Kings, the Fulda abbot Rabanus Maurus around 830 stated in the dedication letters to the imperial chancellor Hilduin of Saint-Denis and to King Louis II, called the German, that he had consulted texts of an, I quote, unknown Jew of our time, not a little proven in the knowledge of the Torah. Hebreus quita moderni temporis in legis scientia non ignobilite eruditus. The texts to which Rabanus referred are the Questiones in Libros Regum et Paralipomenon of the so-called Pseudo-Jerome. It is known from Christian libraries only, but bears no Christian content, except two interpolations. I call the author for that Judeo-Jerome. Following the editions of Jean Matianet and Domenico Valarsi, it is in volume 23 printed of the Patrologia Latina. The text survived until the 13th century in over 60 manuscripts alone. The Verona manuscripts, the oldest one, but textually poor, is Verona Capitolare 23 from the end of the 8th century, and you have here the first pages of these manuscripts on the screen. In two of the manuscripts from the 9th century in Reims and from Saint-Denis, the text was assigned to a Jewish author. Regarding the books of Chronicles, it says, here I show the a photo from the Reims manuscript, folio 58. Here begins the interpretation of the Chronicles according to the tradition of the Jews, where the reader must be careful or cautious. This reserve is explained by the title to the preceding commentary on Kings. Folio 38 states, the interested reader may examine whether the Jew who has interpreted the aforementioned book in this way deviates from church teachings with individual interpretations, or with some sentences. These introductions deserve a closer look. On the one hand, the reserve towards the author is clearly noticeable. In the manuscripts from Reims and Saint-Denis, much more than in Rabanus. On the other hand, this reserve apparently posed no obstacle to incorporating them into ecclesiastical libraries and Christian texts. This may have been due to the lack of suitable commentaries on the Book of Kings, which were politically eminently important for the self-understanding of the Frankish kings. But no matter, the Jewish text was copied and thus ecclesiastically approved. What remained uncommented, and this should be emphasized in Rabanus as in the manuscripts, was the fact that they had the text in Latin script by, as they were sure, a Jewish author. This seems to have been self-evident to them, and they did not ask the questions about where, how, and why, which today want to impose themselves. So for which audience a Jew wrote, if the text was written in Latin? Or who would have been the addressees of a translation of originally Hebrew or Greek text, and who would have managed it if it had been written in another language? But there are no hints to a Hebrew Vorlage, so we can be sure that the text originally was written in Latin. Since the 11th century, first in the Codex of Lorraine, origin that survives from Freising, the Codex Latinus Monacensis 6318, as well as in the Codex from Durham Cathedral and many times more thereafter, these commentaries have been attributed to Jerome, sometimes directly by means of explicit titles, and you have here from the Durham manuscript and the Freising manuscript these attributions to Jerome, sometimes directly by means of explicit titles, sometimes indirectly, as in the 11th century Monte Cassino, Echternach, or Saint-Lefroux manuscripts, by being added to other texts of the Church Father Jerome or those attributed to him. In this case, the Philofilter endowed a Jewish text with the authority of the Church Father and secured for it a place in a corpus of texts that may have served primarily for teaching and reference purposes. This may be explained by the formal proximity of the Jewish commentary on the Book of Kings to Jerome's Questiones on the books of Genesis, which were usually placed at the beginning of such codices. However, the attribution to the Jewish commentaries to Jerome can also be explained by the need to preserve a text that had to stand up to growing anti-Jewish resentment. One need only think of the activities of the Archbishops Agobard and Amelot and their Deacon Florus engaged in from Lyon in the mid-9th century. The nonchalance with which Rabanus introduced the Jewish author in the 830s did not stand up to this. The titles of the codices of Reims and Saint-Denis, which were written a few decades later, are noticeably more reserved. And Angelomus of Luxeuil, who presented another commentary on the books of Kings a generation after Rabanus, was visibly at pain to conceal the share of the Jewish original in his work. Now I turn to the modern ignorance. The clarification of the authorship was already achieved around 1700 by the Maurice Jean Martianet and Antoine Pouguet and the Veronese priest Domenico Valarzi. Against Erasmus, they identified the author of the Questiones on Kings and other texts with the Hebreus known to Rabanus and concluded that he was a Jew and that his text has as much to do with Jerome as the blossom of the marguerite has to do with objects made of glass or brass. I have put in blue the Latin parts where Martianet and Pouguet identify the author of the text as then printed in the Patrologia Latina. Gianluigi Minarelli and Gian Cristoforo Trombelli in their Vittorum Patrum Latinorum Opuscula of 1751 agreed with caution. As they said, the authorship was Natione nisi fallimur ac religione Hebreorum, but also Vulgate nostre fere ateriat. So if they were not, if they were right, the author of a further text by the same author than the Questiones, which they edited, he was of Jewish nation and religion, but he was very close to the use of the Vulgata. More recent editors, however, were not satisfied with this insight. Moritz Abraham Rahner, around 1900, as well as Louis Ginsburg in his Heidelberg dissertation on the Agada bei den Kirchenvätern, the Agada in the Church Fathers, were visibly uncomfortable with the thought of a Jew writing in Latin. Far more than the Morris and the Italian late humanists, they thought in terms of strict social and cultural divisions, and could not imagine a Latin writing Jew. The author of the Questiones appeared to them at best as a half-educated Jew, or better yet, as a Christian with a Jewish teacher who had only half understood the Agadic traditions. The negative judgment of the author's intellectual capacities was due to the fact that they could not imagine a Jew without rabbinical training and familiarity with Agadic traditions, and thus applied standards to the text that did not even begin to fit. It is remarkable, however, how the Catholic Church historian and Rabanus expert Johann Baptist Haplitzel, who was active at the beginning of the 20th century, used Ginsburg as his chief witness. Without further ado, with reference to the authorities of the Wissenschaft des Judentums, he deleted the Hebreus from his account and blatantly violating the literal sense of Rabban's dedicatory letter of 829, declared that the Fulda abbot had the Questiones of an unknown Christian author at hand, as he himself writes to the Archchaplain Hilduin. So you have the German quotation from Haplitzel here. The filtering process, in which the Jewish author was once again forced into the corset of a Christian or at least convert biography, culminated in the addition of the Questiones to the Book of Samuel, presented by Avram Saltman from Bailan in 1975. Note that Saltman based his edition on the 4 oldest manuscripts known to him of the 9th century, and by doing so, he presented a text that was corrupt in places and lagged behind the manuscripts of the 11th and 12th centuries from Durham, Echternach, Monte Cassino, and others, and the citations in Rabanus, which are quite better than the text of the 9th century manuscripts, and thus he came behind, by quality, the edition in Minion. More important is that he mocked the author's lack of education, such as, and his, as I quote, absurd and irresponsible exegesis, which contained again accepted Jewish interpretations. Seen in this way, he recognized in the Hebrews a half-educated convert who became a monk and offered himself to Theodulf of Orleans for Bible revision, thus a charlatan who could play the role in all areas of Hebraica Veritas as pleasantly as undetected. Quote Saltman, he alone knew how pitifully inadequate was his scholarly equipment, that he had no written sources, that he had to rely on his already clouded memory of his elementary studies and his Jewish background. Of course, in his engagement, Saltman overlooked what Matianet and Pouget had already recognized in 1699, that a Jewish Western author of the 7th or 8th century, if resorted to Hebrew biblical text at all, did not have a Masoretic biblical text at hand and could hardly be approached with a rabbinically founded Judaism. This is the quotation from 1699 you have here in my attempt of translation. Admittedly, research has made veritable quantum leaps since the days when Saltman published. A monolithic picture of Judaism in the transitional period between antiquity and the Middle Ages has been replaced by complex understandings that reveal distinct varieties of Judaism. The reasons for this are manifold. The Qumran research and the upswing of pseudepigrapha research, also the opening for literary scientific methods and critical self-reflections of the actors, for whom religious and professional affiliations no longer should dictate epistemically narrow paths, have their share in this. The time seems favorable to harvest fruits, that is, to think things through the end, and that is, to ask also about the life world of the Jews of Ostia, or the woman Juliana, who donated the floor mosaic of the synagogue of Hammam Liv. My current project also addresses the task of identifying a number of other texts in Christian tradition as Jewish texts, especially those in Latin that, unlike Philo and Josephus, originated in the west of the diaspora. In addition to the aforementioned Questiones, a number of other Latin texts of probably the same authorship have survived, including a commentary on the Song of Deborah, Judges 5, a commentary on Habakkuk, a piece on Zechariah that deals with the Jewish fast days under the title De Immunis Disputatio, a text on the Decim Temptationes Israel in Deserto, the 10 temptations of Israel in the desert, and other small pieces such as a short inventory of the Jewish feast days that only partially fits into the cycle of Jewish holidays as we know it today. Furthermore, there is the Lex Dei, di Collatio Legum Mosaicarum et Romanarum, a comparative collation of Roman and biblical provisions on criminal law, which, despite all efforts to the contrary, can hardly be meaningfully described as a text of Christian origin. Then there is the Epistola Annae ad Senecam, which survives only in the 9th century Cologne Cathedral manuscript. And finally, there is the opulent Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum of the so-called Pseudo-Philo, to which one has for decades wanted to ascribe a Hebrew original text and a Greek intermediate stage, but which, in the absence of any paleographic evidence for it, no text in Hebrew, no fragments in Greek or else, is better understood as a text, a Jewish text written in Latin, probably in Rome or elsewhere in Italy, and whose oldest evidence comes from Fulda, again Fulda and Auxerre in the 9th century. The oldest manuscripts for it come from Fulda and the Salzburg-Bavarian area in the 11th century, and I have here the Hersfeld-Fulda manuscript, which is preserved today in the library in Kassel, probably 11th century. Certainly the tableau of Latin texts of Jewish origin filtered through Christian traditions, sketched here, appears decidedly heterogeneous. Exegetica, prose, juridica, parabiblica, a little bit of everything, which seems inconsistent and what at first sight hardly justifies the concept of a corpus of Jewish Latin text of the pre-rabbinic period. However, I would like to reverse this impression and argue that here on the church side are preserved only spolia, parts, fragments, which, whatever may have caused their preservation, convey just fragmentary idea of the broadness of the intellectual world of Western Judaism before the reception of Rabbinic Judaism. The question of how texts of Jewish origin were dealt with cannot be answered simply. Archchancellor Hilduin in 829 and King Louis in 834 or so were instructed. Rabanus did not want to impose the interpretations of the Hebrews on the Book of Kings on them at all, but to leave it to their judgment. The readers in Saint-Denis and Reims were warned, you have seen it, cautiously they should read because the author could deviate from the ecclesiastical teachings in some points. Hincmar of Reims, Archbishop, used the Lex Dei for his arguments against the divorce petition of Emperor Lothar and from his wife Teutberga. Whether he had any idea of the Jewish authorship is unclear. However, he cited this comparative law collection with a strangely convoluted title as Primus Liber Legis Romana, the first book of the law of the Romans. This sounds a bit like Pseudo-Isidore, and that is only too apt according to time, place, and person. So I emphasize Hincmar was, first of all, a politician. Should Hincmar have been aware of the Jewish origin of the Lex Dei, he, who in everything acted according to the motto that the purpose sanctifies the bishop's share, might have cared very little. Philo, on the other hand, was beyond all doubt. Rabanus simply wrote, Philo autem libro supradicto questionum suarum in Genesis narrat. Philo tells in his book on the questions on Genesis that and that and that. He could not know that he was quoting here from the Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum of Pseudo-Philo, and not Philo's Questiones et Solutiones in Genesis. The undisputed authority of the Alexandrians secured acceptance for the strange work all the way up to Nicolaus Cusanus in the 15th century. Heim of Auxerre also knew the LAB, the Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum, but did not name an author, which is only typical for this free spirit. Traces are also to be found in Remigius of Auxerre and Helinand of Fort. As seen, the filter instruments functioned admirably. In most manuscripts of the Questiones on kings, reference to the Jewish author or Jewish origin are missing, as well as in not a few quotations in the Glossa Ordinaria. Jerome's name spread a protective mantle over this and other texts and ensured their survival. In order to investigate this more closely, it is worth to conclude with a look at what was probably the most original exegetical Christian workshop of the Carolingian period, the School of Auxerre. Hebrae dicunt, Hebrae habent, Hebrae volunt, also Hebrae insinuant, Hebrae autumnant. So the Hebrews say, the Hebrews have, they want, they insinuate, they even make us to believe. Such argumentation in Itzia are encountered there everywhere. With digital instruments today, it is easy to prove that Jerome was by no means quoted in most of these cases, as medieval readers might have thought. In the commentaries on Genesis and other biblical books, Auxerre simply made use of the pattern that Jerome had abundantly employed in his Questiones on Genesis and elsewhere. What is exciting is what emerges behind this practice in Auxerre. Carolingians not only knew and copied Latin Jewish texts, but they, to put it carefully, had also access to traditions and motifs which were otherwise known only from Midrash and Targum. Burton William Edwards, in his edition of the Remigius commentary on Genesis in the Corpus Christianorum Continuatio Medievalis, has compiled a whole list of passages where, in referring to Hebrae, there is a implicit quotation of what is known from Targumim and Midrashim. To be precise, these are hardly direct quotations. Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, in which Edwards found many parallels, is, according to recent insight, written only in the 12th century. Günther Stemberger argues it is written in the 7th century with later interpolations, so there is a discussion among the Targumists under the way. That the authors of a Targum of Pseudo-Jonathan in the 12th century would have drawn from the Latin commentary of Remigius, of all things, is, however, hardly likely. By the way, this also applies to the opposite way. The assumption that Latin translations of Midrash, Genesis, Rabbah, or older Targumim would have existed in Auxerre. There are no traces of this, and the question of the possible target audience of such translations does not allow a satisfactory answer. I don't think that we can think at all into this direction. It can also be excluded that the exegetes in Auxerre, and by the way also Alcuin before that at the beginning of the 9th century, would have known enough Hebrew to help themselves directly to the text, because at least Remigius indicates that he did not only not know any Hebrew, but he did even have not any idea of the right aligned course of the scriptures when he tried to explain the age of Abraham, 175. When he tells us in the Hebrew the order is perverted, since they put the lower number always first. So the Quinkve, the Chamesh, he had found in the beginning, reading from left to right, and having no idea that Hebrew is read from right to the left. So he had no idea at all about Hebrew, but he made much use of it, and this is the fascinating thing at that point. Excuse me for a moment. This is not beer, this is my own grown apple juice. I'm in Hessen, not in Bavaria. It is not easy to provide precise evidence of what was known in Auxerre and where it came from. A large number of places where exegetes refer to Hebrew actually have parallels in Jewish literature, but also in the works of the church fathers. Nevertheless, the authors in Auxerre told Hebrae habent and not Augustinus habent. But there are parallels in Jerome and Augustine and also in the Ambrosiaster. And in view of the libertarian citation system that was used in Auxerre, in difference to Alcuin and Rabanus in Tours and Fulda, one does not want to trust any information without reliable evidence. However, some examples can be given of the processing of templates that have only come down to us from Jewish context and are beyond any doubt. This is the case when interpretations are particularly unconventional and objectively unnecessary. I would like to present such an example in detail. So this is on Genesis 42:3. Maybe you can see it in the top of the page. This is the process of Joseph 10 brothers went down that they may buy nutrition in Egypt. Genesis 42 verse 3. And Remigius claims to have drawn his interpretation from the Hebrews. Accordingly, Joseph's brothers entered the city individually while looking for grain so that they would not be accused of espionage. Aiunt Hebrae filius Jacob ob nimiam quae secum erat multitudinem simul omnis per unam civitatis portam introissen nodum isse, sed singuli fratris divisi per singulas portas intraverunt, etc., etc. The version in Midrash Genesis Rabbah comes fairly close to it. Said Rav Judah bar Simeon, So too Joseph knew that his brothers were coming down to Egypt. What did he do? He set up guards to the gates. The translation has to the 10 gates, but I don't see the 10 in the Hebrew. And said to them, write down the name of everyone who enters. It's taken from the 10 brothers and then put into the translation. The version in Targum Pseudo-Jonathan reads almost like a parallel text. Also, the rumor of Joseph's supernatural powers replaces the suspicion of espionage as justification. So this is the translation by Maher. The sons of Israel came each one by a different gate, lest the evil eye should have power over them if they came together to purchase among the Canaanites who were coming to purchase, for there was a famine in the land of Canaan. And the same applies finally to Rashi, who is 250 and more years later than the school of Auxerre. They hid themselves in the crowd that people should not recognize them, for their fathers had bidden them not to show themselves all at one entrance to the city, but that each should enter by a different gate in order that the evil eye should not have power over them, for they were all handsome and stalwart men. The question of entering gates appears to be of secondary importance for the understanding of the words of the scripture. One wonders why the idea of distributed access to all came about in the first place. However, exactly for this reason, the episode is informative for the analysis of the course of tradition. Christian literature offers no parallel for Remigius' interpretation, and he says, Hebreidiko. After all, the number of gates played a role in the Midrash before Remigius, and there are more explicit correspondences in Rashi and the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan. Other Targumim and other rabbinic literature, to the best of my knowledge, offer nothing of the sort. Without having to claim direct dependencies, it follows that there were Jewish traditions tangible in the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan and in Rashi, but also in Remigius, which, without being able to make more precise statements about the channels of reception, were known in Auxerre in the 9th century. I want to conclude, go back to what I have said at the beginning about linguistically and medially open spaces and about the resources of motives that are not closed behind religious borders and that it should certainly not be implemented retrospectively as Harplitzl and others have done. Rabanus expressed no surprise at the availability of Jewish texts in Latin in his time. The writer of the Saint-Denis manuscript even made an effort to erase, and you can see this part here on the screen, to erase one of the later Christian interpolations to the text and skipped what you see in the Reims manuscript above with the red point. But what the younger Leipzig manuscript did not have, aliter tamen Dominus in Evangelio. Otherwise, the Lord says in the Gospel. So the Saint-Denis writer tried to save the Jewish integrity of the text and erase the name of Christ from a Christian manuscript. I would say this is perhaps the only instance that a Christian writer erased the name of Christ from a Christian manuscript. I don't know any other example. Because he was sure this does not belong to the original text, as we have also the tradition in Rabanus, who quoted this part, and he had no idea of aliter tamen Dominus in Evangelio, and as some of the other manuscripts like the Leipzig or the Bonpland manuscript in Paris and others. Only modern editors could not come to terms with Jewish texts in Latin, perhaps because, like Harplitzl, they were influenced by the culture-fighting spirit, Kulturkampfgeist, of the First Vatican Council, and imposed their own understanding of religion on the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries, or the 9th centuries. Rashi, a recent work claims, paid little attention to religious boundaries when it came to suitable instruments for understanding scripture. According to Mordechai Cohn's study of 2021, Rashi is said to have derived the model of literary exegesis, which became the sign of his school of exegesis in Troyes, not from the Jewish grammarians of the Iberia, but from the slightly younger Bruno de Carthusian, a Christian literal exegete, and this created the pshat, the Jewish pshat of Rashi. So far my presentation, and yeah, so I thank you for your patience, and gratiam vobis ago.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Heil, for this thought-provoking presentation, which enables us to recover a whole body of text, of lost text, and for the way you used the original attribution of the early medieval attribution of the text and the fate of Christian interpolations as argument to recover them. So I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, so please manifest yourself. I do have a question, if no one wants to go. Where? Professor Bohak, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. This was very interesting. I have to say many of these texts are new to me, so I won't comment on these texts, but I want to ask you, you very briefly mentioned Agobard and Amulo. And of course, with Agobard and Amulo, we have their own descriptions of Jewish views that we know very well from Jewish sources, you know, from Shiur Koma, from Toldot Yeshu, from other clearly Jewish texts. So there we know that they were both speaking with real Jews, having access to real Jewish texts. And I was wondering that you didn't try to compare what they say with the materials you find in the text you identify.
I will mention this, but also only in brief in my book, because there is an unsolved dispute in friendship with Peter Schäfer. Peter is sure that Agobard and Amulo know Toldot Yeshu, at least one recension as we know it today. I argue they had ideas of materials which we later find in Toldot Yeshu, for example. So I'm not sure if they really knew a text, or like these people in Auxerre not far away had access to motifs which they incorporated in Auxerre and in Lyon as well. In the case of Auxerre for exegesis, and in the case of Lyon for polemics. But this would be I'm afraid this would be an other project. This is not just a chapter in a book.
Mm-hmm.
But thank you for the question, Gideon. It's important, but it's a part I'm still dealing with, and I have to sit also with Peter and others to discuss these things more in detail, and to put more to have more time to go in this part. But this may be exactly the bridge to your project.
Okay. Let me just add very briefly that I'm now doing a lot of work on Toldot Yeshu, on the earliest versions of Toldot Yeshu, and I too have no doubt that Agobard and Amulo knew the text that I'm working on, which was first written in Aramaic, and they had access to it probably indirectly, probably through Jews who read it in Aramaic and explained to them what is written in the text. And there's so many motifs from that text that they know of that this can't be accidental.
This may well
again,
be
this is not necessarily
possible, as this I did not. I can fully follow as in the first, maybe that our Judah Jerome, who was probably writing in the 7th century, shows the first meetings of Latin Jews with Hebrew-speaking Jews, because our author speaks about the Hebrews, but he does not write as a Christian. So there is a difference between him as a Hebreus Latinus and the Hebrews, the people, and he speaks even the eruditores in Ilius Linguae, the more experienced in that language. So, so in the 9th century, it's well possible that Hebrew speakers, Aramaic speakers, were around and could translate what is written in non-Latin texts. That's right. Yeah.
Is there any other question or comment? David, go ahead.
Johannes, thank you. This, for me, was illuminating, but your erudition always is. I wanted to ask you, because I should say I've been learning from Johannes for more than half my life, so this is not a surprise to me that he opens my... I wanted to add that, or ask about, we're obsessed with co-production here, and that means that we have to always ask, try generalize from the objects that we are studying to the general frame of our inquiry. And to that end, I wanted to ask if you could expatiate on the many notions or the different attitudes towards Israeliyat, to borrow a term from a different field, that emerge in the material that you are using, ranging from kauta, so from here, this was written by a Jew, so be careful, but I'm going to give it to you because it's useful, to just appropriation and ignoring. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about any shifts you see there, or any generalizations you could make about these more general attitudes towards the borrowing or the sources of knowledge.
Oh, thank you so much, David. And what you told about learning, I can say the same about our encounter for many decades, starting with reviewing our PhD works when they came out. And I've learned so much about you, and I'm glad to be back with you now in the context of the Princeton project. Now, the question to generalize the attitudes, there are two different lines. First of all, on a semantic level, the Reims and the Saint-Denis manuscript, they are speaking about Judeus. And Rabanus is speaking about Hebrews. So this is one is a different approach on the surface of the text. Actually, Rabanus copies the identification of the others in Judeo-Jerome when he is speaking about Hebrei Dikunt, and Rabanus says he has quoted the Hebrew. But the author of the Questiones exactly considers himself not to be a Hebrew, because this is a linguistic assignation he is making to the others who probably are coming from the land of Israel, and they are Hebrew speakers. The next thing is that you have a dramatic swift of attitudes towards the non-Christian text. There is kind of, you may call it, I have called it nonchalance. There is kind of, this is a Jewish text of great interest, so I present the content to even to the king, to King Louis. And he may make his own decisions what he believes about the opinions of this Hebrew. He simply presents the material because it is there. He says that he has no definitive opinion about it. Nevertheless, building wide parts of his comments on kings on the ground of this Jewish author. And then you have the hesitation by Angelomus, who all the time blames the Hebrews, but not telling that he is using a Jewish source. He blames the Hebrews for wrong ideas, which he corrects, but following him in many ways. So he is concealing the Jewish authorship behind an anonymous expression of the Hebrews or the Jews. Yeah. And I think that the reception of the titles of Reims and Saint-Denis, that we don't find them in later manuscripts, has to do with the fact that a non-Christian text was in later times not acceptable, less acceptable in ecclesiastical circles, at least up to the Victorines, much later. One open question to me is the title of the Orléans manuscript, which is also from the 9th century, which tells there is an erasure in the title page, and in that manuscript and in St. Gallen, the most interesting case is a title, Expositionuncula Authentica in Libros Regum. And you have almost the impression Expositionuncula Authentica doesn't make so much sense, that actually this was Expositio Judaica, which was turned by its title into Expositionuncula Authentica. So there are many open questions, but you see that the use of these Jewish sources caused some tension already during the 9th century, and the most liberal with his approach was most probably Rabanus.
Thank you very much for this answer, which recenters us on co-production and versus appropriation. If no one has a direct comment or question, maybe I will use my privilege and ask one. So I wanted to ask you about, does the hypothesis that some old Latin version of the Hebrew Bible or all the Apocrypha would have been written by Jews, does it come into play to your argument? Do you consider that to be possible?
And I really focus on those fragments which we can grasp in the West. And this could be the starting point for further discussion with pseudepigrapher researchers, but I'm definitively at that stage not going into Central or Eastern Mediterranean apocryphal and pseudepigraphical texts. This would be two ways, simply a perspective. I have already the great diversity of genres, and in my aim is in this project to bring together these isolated discussions, which are among historians of law on the lex de and exegetes on the questiones, and biblical scholars on the Antiquitatum Biblicarum. They all consider their stuff to be an exception in their respective field, and to bring it on a level that we have a transdisciplinary discussion on quite a number of texts of Jewish origin, and not as an exception in a respective field like history of law.
Okay, thank you very much. Anthony?
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to ask a question. That was fascinating. I'd like to ask a question about, which it perhaps is an invitation to speculation, but maybe we can know more about it than I fear. And the question is really on the processes by which Latinophone Jewish cultures who produced the text that you've shown us gave way to Hebrew language communities. Are we talking about a process of replacement or of supplementing, large-scale migration, or rather educational reorientation, and new networks being established within diaspora communities? Do you have any sense of how this process happens and how it looks on the ground in terms of people?
Well, we have rabbinical traditions about rabbis going west, going to Rome. We have inscriptions in Venosa, and an inscription which mentions rabbites who are praying at the grave of a young girl from a high-ranking family. So there are single indications of connections of a communication within the greater diaspora. But in a general way, I understand the West, especially with Italy and what is today Tunisia, as a specific cultural Jewish space within the late antiquity of the Roman West, getting into contact with the new developments from the East, sometime with the 6th, 7th, 8th century, and becoming then integrated into this vaster space of Jewish communication, probably until Spain in the 9th century. From then on, the use of this text I'm referring to may have been more and more withered away among Western Jews. Nevertheless, it may be that much of the ideas which we identify today in Rashi as his own interpretations, because they are not mentioned in the known from the Midrash and seem to be innovative, may draw onto these older Jewish traditions in the West, which then were singled out from the Jewish libraries from the Middle Ages as we know them. So you asked for speculation, and I know that I'm with this project always in danger of speculating, but Anthony, we both know how much we like to speculate, and sometimes idea becomes more substance when two scholars are speculating together in cooperation, in co-production.
Any other question, remark? I can go on for a long time then. Okay, I can ask one. So I will ask another one. It's a methodological one because I wanted to draw a parallel between the method you are using to investigate literary text and current happening in the study of material cultures. Because at the beginning, you mentioned a few synagogues from the Western Empire, among which the synagogue of Elche. And the synagogue of Elche was originally identified as a Christian basilica before it was re-identified as a synagogue, as far as I know, because for the first excavators, they didn't see any specifically Jewish identity marker inside it. And I feel like this is now a trend in the study of late antiquity to reassess identification based on the presence of or absence of Christian identity marker, and by putting forward the hypothesis that if there is no Christian identity marker, then it opens up the possibility that it's a non-Christian text, and in your case, a Jewish text or material. So do you have any additional comment you could make about that?
Well, I'm not an archaeologist. I always have to be careful with interpreting buildings, but sometimes I also think we should not leave the archaeologists alone with the task to understand buildings and other things. I know about the discussion about Elche and the different opinions about it because of these unsecured findings. Do we have signs of Christianity? Do we have Jewish signs? Do we have both? Was it turned from a church into a synagogue and again back to a church and so on? I refer more to the four synagogues we can clearly identify as such according to clear signatures, to clear symbols, which are those two in Tunisia and two in Italy. And there is the other discussion about Carthago, which is more or less similar to the discussion in Elche. I'm doing archaeological work with texts, right? The absence of Christianity in Latin text can give a hint to a Jewish origin. If then, in addition, and this is important to me, authors of the 9th century and writers, copyists, clearly state it is a Jewish text. So then I can, with good reasons, assume that indeed we do have a Jewish text here. Then the next step is when I know that authors of the 9th century considered the Questiones on Kings to be a Jewish text, when we have other texts with the same stylistic characteristics, certain constructions, certain terms which repeatedly appear and have a similar flavor, and they appear in the same codices. So I can even argue that the commentary on Deborah on Judges 5 or Zechariah, even that no one says this is a Jewish text, can be considered to be also a Jewish text because they belong, I don't know if it's the same author, maybe it's the same school. Maybe we have to deal with a group of authors. I can't be sure about a single author, but I can consider these texts to be Jewish texts. Yeah. I would say it's easier to identify a text as being Jewish than a building which has no Jewish signs or symbols.
Thank you very much. Katharina, you have a comment or a question to offer?
Yeah, I think I have a question, a very simple one. I think perhaps it's also banal, but I'm wondering what Jewish actually means here. What it means in the manuscripts. So who or what does make the text Jewish? Is it that we think it's from a Jewish author, but what does that mean then? You know, does that mean, should we imagine them to go to the synagogue, or what kind of Jewish are those authors? And then I wanted to ask you how you deal with the fact that when identifying a text as Jewish or Christian, you obviously have to deal with your own expectations, what a Christian author would have or so. And if you are saying, okay, if there's nothing specifically Christian in a text, how do you know what Christians at that time would, how do you know what you are missing? So the question is, what or who makes the Jewish in that cases?
Thank you, Katharina, for these questions. Let's we have tendencies from, let's say, Jerome to Alcuin, what we could expect for a commentary on Kings. And if there are certain sentences, for example, on David and his installment in becoming a king, and we can with certainty expect some Christological references in a Christian text at that point. And if this text remains completely on in historical description of the kingdom of the kingship of David, and we have one and the other such instance where we would expect, knowing Christian traditions, the interpreter to go into certain directions, then we can with good reasons say, well, the lack of such Christian interpretations in a longer commentary is a clear indication for the Jewish origin of that text, especially when authors of the 9th century call it a Jewish text.
I mean, I think what I find so fascinating with your work is that you show us that our idea of Judaism in the Middle Ages is too narrow, you know, that it was much more diverse when we would expect. But the same could well be with Christianity. So it could also, couldn't it also be that there are texts we would not expect to be Christian, as we would not expect to be those texts Jewish? and that, for instance, that incipit with Jewish could also mean it's Jewish, it's too Jewish in the sense of heresy or so, you know, there is missing something specific Christian, but I do not know whether the author was Jewish or not. This is what I'm trying to find out, because I think the very strength of what you're doing is to show us how diverse Judaism was and could be, and that there was not only rabbinic Judaism, but yes, as I said, it may well be that also Christianity in the later Middle Ages was not only the Jerome filter, let's say.
Well, thank you, Katharina. I'm quite sure that looking at the synagogue of Ostia and seeing the strength of this Judaism in the West, I'm sure there has been more than only a Bible scroll or Torah scroll and some oral traditions, but that this was a proto-literal culture of its own. I know that many of the arguments I'm presenting may raise discussions and will not find acceptance everywhere. But what I'm doing is to put the questions on the table, because when I have arguments, and I have in the works I have studied instances where I'm really I don't know what if to laugh or to cry. When I read the beginning of the Epistola Aneazinicam, this starts with Fratres Carissimi. And then it said it's a Christian text because Fratres Carissimi is a term from Paul. So this must be Christian. I want to broaden the perspectives and invite people for something which is not so a narrow reading inside their own disciplines, but to be open and to read these texts openly. And when I have this different signs of identity attribution to such texts in the 9th century, so I'm very critical with the approach of the 19th and 20th century, who have a certain idea of what Judaism is, because it is Judaism in the present on rabbinical and other traditions, and then rescribing everything into a distant path and changing the past through a modern lens. So this is what I'm presenting. That it will raise discussions is quite clear to me, but I'm looking forward to it.
Me too, but Shlomo is raising.
Shlomo, you can go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for the paper. Really interesting, and always interesting to think about new connections and between groups that you would usually not associate. In that vein, and regarding your case study of the brothers of Joseph entering in different gates, so I'm just going to put something in the chat very quickly, and I'll read it. This is from the surah about Joseph in the Quran, 1267, and he enjoined them, being Jacob, told his sons, "My sons, do not enter the city by one gate, rather enter it by different gates." And then a comment about Allah and his command. So how do you think about this text? Now for those who are waiting for an Islamic reference, now we have one. But how do you sort of triangulate between the sources? This putatively Christian, maybe Jewish text, the obvious, the early Jewish sources, Genesis Rabbah being prior to any of these other texts. So obviously the first source is pretty clearly Jewish. But do you see this text from the Quran as having any connection to the other texts, to Pseudo Jonathan, to the text that you're focusing on. You know, how do you sort of triangulate that, especially if, as I think you said a couple of minutes ago, the expectation is that there is a lot of movement of ideas from east to west. We're not limited in that way. I mean, certainly, you know, Islam ideas travel very quickly within the various empires. So how would you sort of think about this this text in the Quran in relation to the other materials that you presented?
Yeah, thank you so much, Shlomo. This is I will take a photo from the chat and think how to bring it into chapter 2 of my book, because I was not aware of Surah 1267, but actually when you asked about connections, I'm not sure if there are connections, but they are taking those ideas from a common ground of traditions and motives. This is not to say that the surah is dependent from the Midrash and the Midrash from the Talmud and whatever, but there is they have access to a pool of ideas and traditions, and this is what. And thank you so much for this. What we can see in that case in the surah. It's fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe going after that, maybe you mentioned that in your presentation, but I may not have caught it. In all the Jewish Latin texts that you have identified, is there anything that you would call, for lack of a better phrase, distinctly Western as opposed to a pool of ideas common with Eastern Jewish communities?
I have to think about it more, but I understand this text being text from the West, but I perhaps so far shouldn't call it Western text, because I ascribe with Western a certain character, certain content to it, which I well, the way of argumentation when you take rabbinical discussions, they are technically, semantically different from the texts I have in the West. But I would need to think about if there are significant differences by content. And actually, I don't see that. So let's call it text from the West and Western diaspora with its own culture, but not Western in the sense of certain ideas which are typically for the West in difference to the East. But thank you, this is a very important point. Yeah.
Thank you. Jillian, you.
Thank you so much for this, Dr. Heil. I really enjoyed listening to this. I really particularly enjoyed your point about these are phenomena that appear isolated when you're looking within specific genre, but actually when you look in a broader transdisciplinary sense, they're appearing. And when I'm listening to this, I'm hearing, well, when you said they're pulling from a shared pool of ideas, it triggered for me. One idea that I had when listening to this is it's almost like a minor current that's flowing through these literary productions that again seems isolated when we look in specific context. So I'm thinking of water metaphors, but I wonder if you could expand if there were any models or like language models, you know, metaphors basically that you're using to think about this, because I do think so much of what's interesting about this is the level of model that we're using, language of co-production, et cetera. And so I apologize for the sort of vagueness of this question, but I was just wondering if you could give some more examples of models or metaphors that you're using to think about the process that you're identifying, because I'm finding them fruitful.
Thank you so much, Jillian. I know that my project stands a little bit in tension with the idea, in a productive sense, with the idea of co-production. As there are not people working at different places or in different contexts and knowing about each other and producing something, but by incident, remnants of a older Jewish culture found their way into a Christian tradition, where at some points considered and known to be Jewish traditions, and then became Jerome's and were considered to be texts by Jerome until the end of the 17th century. As it happened to the pseudo-Philo, who remained the renowned church's father, honoris causa Philo, until Nicolaus of Cusa, and only with the first editions of the work, linguists, grammarians, text scholars came onto it that this Latin can't be a Latin, even in a translation from a Greek text from Philo, and that actually the content in part contradicts the ideas of Philo of Alexandria. So until this late scholastic time, Christian scholars kept Philo in highest esteem, and especially the Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum, which is hard to read because the Latin sometimes is not clear, and so on and so on. But nor Philo nor the author of pseudo-Philo, or we better may call it pseudo-Phila, because there is so much female content in the Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum that we can't know with certainty that the author was a woman, but it would hard to prove that the author was a man with so much female content in it. So this is also something we should clarify about the Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum. But they had no idea that it would become important for Christian readers and in Christian theological context. Nevertheless, I imagine that actually, so we may ask, what was the Bible of these Western Jews? When you're speaking with Bible scholars, they often say, well, the Vetus Latina is the Bible of the Church before the Vulgata in the West. But when it comes to the question, what was the Bible text for these Jews? And when we think about co-production and cohabitation, I guess that this open space of motives, which were accessible, as we have just seen from Shlomo, even for the Quran, we can imagine that there was much exchange or knowledge in the time of the origins of those texts in the West among Latin speakers, independent if they consider themselves to be Christians or Jews. And we even have to count on people in between in the time of the 5th, 6th century, which were not decided in a way that they belonged to an established church. Or I'm also speaking only about Jewish, Germany, it would be Gemeinschaften of Jewish groups or communities, but not about the Jewish community, because I have no idea about the constitution of the Jews in Ostia, where an association in the Roman juridical sense, did they create an idea of community in a more than only legal way, and so on and so on. It's so we have to be careful to express or to coin, to frame these people according to the rules we know today with established Jewish communities, which are bodies of public law. Yeah? And so we can only make assumptions, asking questions which are necessary to avoid false answers. But to say those Jews were that and that and that and that would be irresponsible. And so it's with the authors of these texts and the ways they work out their texts. We don't know enough how they put themselves into the context of their time, as we know them only through the reception by later scholars. And Rabanus was sure that this author of the Questiones would be a contemporary, a man of more or less of his time, or a woman, and had no idea that probably this text was 300 years old. By the way, we can exclude now with certainty that the assistant of Theodulf in Orleans, who assisted Theodulf in correcting the Bible text at order by command of Charlemagne, that this Hebreus is not the same person than the author of the Questiones, because the Verona manuscript is 25, 30 years older and has already a much corrupted version of the Questiones. So the author must be much older than the end of the 8th century, so he can't be the same figure who assisted Theodulf in correcting the Bible. I know I didn't answer your question, but I hope I have commented on it.
You did. That was fascinating. Thank you.
Can go along with it.
Katharina, would you like to react to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify about our idea of co-production. I don't think it's really, that this idea, as we have it about co-production, needs people consciously producing something together. This is what I would call the Hollywood misunderstanding of the co-production. That is, of course, the term might be misleading, but this is exactly not what we think is co-production about. So I would say that what you are working on could be a beautiful case of co-production. But to follow up on Jill's question, perhaps it would be interesting for us to know how the metaphor of the filter came to your mind, because you are talking about the Philo filter and so on. This is, I think, a metaphor that somehow is related to how co-production works. But perhaps you could elaborate a bit on that. What exactly is the filter? What is filtered out? What put you? what do you put in, and what comes out? And perhaps that could help us to understand a bit more what kind of co-production is going on here.
Well, this metaphor is rather simple, that we don't know if the works of Philo opera que super sunt, in the sense of Kohn and Wendland, if this is the real Philo. Only what was of interest for the church, and there may have been a choice, went through this filter and came into the space of the church, of ecclesiastical libraries. Maybe there were many other things who were which were not received by ecclesiastical authors, and part of Philo is lost. Well, I have to say, when I go through the works which we know, there are many things in the work of Philo I don't really understand what was the interest of ecclesiastical readers in those texts. So it gives the impression that the Philo we know is more or less complete, but maybe that there are parts which are lost and we have no idea about it. So our Philo we know today actually is a Christian filtered Philo, and not the man who worked in his time in the Greek Jewish community of Alexandria. And it's even more when I call the Questiones themselves by Julius Jerome are widely incomplete. Not only that it may be that in the original they were more closest than a commentary, but it's simply some of these closest do not make sense before something before is lacking to which the clause refers. So we can be sure the version we have is incomplete. Why this happened, when this happened, where this happened, we do not know. Is this a Christian redaction which erased things which were contradicting Christians' ideas? Or is this simply a lack, was it a bad defected manuscript which came to the hand of the first Christian copyists who brought it into a Christian circulation, probably still in Italy before the Carolingian emphasis on transferring texts and books from the south to the north during in about 800. We have no idea. But when you go through the text, then the mini edition is quite good. You see, many parts of the text do not make sense. Nevertheless, copyists ornamented the text with wonderful initials, so they put emphasis on the text. It was not just the text written down because it was there. They invested much energy in incorporating even such an obviously fragmentary text into a wonderful manuscript. The Dahel manuscript is wonderful and has wonderful initials, even that the text is deficient in a considerable way. And I have no idea why we do have, and this is again the filter, why we do have a commentary on Habakkuk, but we have no other commentaries on the Minor Prophets. Why do we have a fragment on Deborah, but not a commentary on the book of Judges? So why this chapter in a consistent commentary in that case, but why not the other chapters of Judges? I have no idea. So some filter was there, but I can't describe exactly what made the filter work.
Yeah, going off on the language that you just mentioned of the Latin language, I had a question about that, because often you see written in scholarly literature that Latin-speaking Jews did not master Latin very well because they use Greek declension and so on. So would you say that the Latin language of your text is of average, good quality, better quality than the Latin texts which we know are translated from the Greek?
I'm hesitating to call something good or bad Latin, because exactly this was the problem with the Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum, that scholars considered the Latin to be bad because of Gracisms and Hebraisms. And so came up the idea already in the early 16th century that there was a Hebrew urtext and a Greek intermediary. But when you go into when you take the inscriptions, the funerary inscriptions of the time, you find they are switching from Latin to Greek and sometimes to Hebrew, and you have Greek words written in Hebrew, vice versa in Latin, and so on. So there was a hybridity of language practice, which is typical for the late antiquity, not only among Jews. When we are approaching those texts with our school Latin and some idea of Cicero and Boetius, and reading those texts, we say, oh, they are really bad. It is bad Latin. But this is a very modern scholarly concept of Latinity and not of a spoken and a practiced language. So this is not the Latin of Cassiodorus, what we have there. But nevertheless, it's the Latin of that time.
Anthony?
I'd like to ask a question on the same subject, actually, on Greek. But you've talked many about Latin texts. Have you a sense of whether a similar picture emerges within the Grecophone world for the way that Jewish communities operate? Do they move from? Is there a sort of comparable story in the Grecophone world, or does it take on different contours? And the other question related is whether these Latinophone communities, you said already that there are Hellenisms in the Latin, but should we think of these as being Latin-speaking communities, or maybe also Greek-speaking communities that were in dialogue with with Hellenistic Judaism?
Thank you. Well, okay, there was there an intervention? I heard the voice others than Anthony, but okay. Well, for Greek texts, others know better, but there is Greek literary production after Philo, and there are traditions going to Byzantine Jewry. The importance of Bible novels like Joseph and Asenath and Asteris, this is an ongoing research and text being present. So I would not be surprised if we could more identify even from the Greek realm more texts being Jewish than we know today. But this is nothing I have actively touched to. But according to the logic of my approach, it would be no surprise if we would have versa texts also in Greek. Now, for the criticisms in the Latin, we have simply to count onto a daily life in the world in which Latin and Greek had different functions, which merged more and more probably in the late antiquity. And those Latin speakers may have known also some Greek and vice versa, and mingling these languages in their practice from time to time. So I wouldn't make a clear division between Greek and Latin speaking Jews also in the West, because we have these B and trilingual inscriptions. Interestingly, sometimes with different functions of the language. Take, for example, the memorial stone for a certain Anna from Oria in southern Italy. I think it belongs to Puglia. That part, the Latin version on the top of the stone, addressed to a wider public, because this was probably a stone standing in the public and not on a cemetery, mentions that the father of that girl was Rabbi Julius. The Hebrew at the side of the text does only mention the name of the father, but not the title of a rabbi. So I have no definitive answer, but I know that is a question. Why the Latin issues the rank of the father and the Hebrew does not? So this is, I'm sure someone like Giancarlo Lacerenza would be able to give an appropriate answer on this, or Cesare Colafemina would have been able to do so. But we have this, let's even say, these people are playing with languages in a certain way. They give languages a different function.
And have you seen any sign that Greek continues in the function of a holy language, continuing use of the Septuagint as the Bible, for instance, in Jewish communities, Latin-speaking Jewish communities, that sort of thing?
I can not say that I have seen signs, but as a liturgical inscription, as a memorial inscription in a religious space, the Hammam Leaf inscription is the only one we have in the West, because in difference to synagogue inscriptions in the Galilee, on the Golan, or also at the Yamal Melech in En-Gedi, there are in other synagogues no floor inscriptions. The Ostia synagogue we can identify as a synagogue only because of the menorah on the architrave of the Arana Kodesh on and the building. Could go back to the slide, but there is no definitive Jewish inscription in any language on that place in Ostia. So the only inscription we have is the one in Latin, poor Latin, and the others in poor Latin. There are several inscriptions in Hammam Leaf, which are in Latin and no Greek. With the funerary inscriptions in catacombs and on cemeteries. And cemeteries, actually, it's Venosa and some other findings up to Narbonne. Those inscriptions are bilingual, they are or in Greek or in Latin, and sometimes with few Hebrew formulas, like Shalom, Al Israel, and other short formulas. Then in the latest level layer of the Venosa catacomb in the Basilicata, there are some poor Hebrew, purely, not poor, completely Hebrew inscriptions, and from the cemetery where we have only the stones, but we do not know where it has been because they are built into the Church of Santa Trinita. So it's a complicated story with hybrid use and diverse performance of languages. It's a topic for itself.
Thanks.
So we are now approaching the end of the session. So is there any parting comments or remark or last question?
So, Maureen, before you shut down, I want to take a photo from Shlomo's comment and citation from the Quran.
Here it is.
That I have this.
I can also send it to you.
Okay, no, I have it.
Okay.
Shlomo, if I quote it, I will have a reference to you that this is your contribution to my book.
Sounds good.
Should we end there? Yeah, then? Okay, so once again, thank you very much, Professor Heil, for this fascinating talk. We can give you a round of applause. And thank you very much for helping us further our definition of co-production with this whole new body of material that is very thought-provoking. Thank you once again.
Johannes.
Thank you, and Maureen, and Carson, and Katharina, and David. And all good wishes for Gideon and all the people from Israel. And thank you all for being here this afternoon, and see you soon.